This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and the sponsor for this episode is the Georgian Papers Program.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 174 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. It's February 2018, and doctors have declared this year's cold and flu season to be severe. They say it's because it started early and has already caused more hospitalizations than any other flu season over the last decade. Plus, it's been responsible for more than 50 pediatric deaths in the United States. Now, as severe as our seasonal flu epidemic is this year, it's nothing compared to the epidemics of yellow fever that took hold in the early American Republic. Between the 1790s and early 1800s, yellow fever struck cities like Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston. And this leads us to wonder, what happened when epidemic diseases struck early America? And how exactly did early Americans deal with disease and illness? Thomas Appel, author of Feverish Bodies, Enlightened Minds, Science and the Yellow Fever Controversy in the Early American Republic, has some answers for us. Now, as we explore the yellow fever epidemics of the early Republic, Thomas reveals what yellow fever is, how it's transmitted, and what the disease does to the body. So, yes, we will briefly talk about blood and vomit in this episode, how yellow fever came to the United States, and how early Americans thought about, treated, and worked to combat outbreaks of yellow fever. But first, the Ben Franklin's World email newsletter serves as your guide to each week's new episode. It places the show notes for each new episode right in your inbox. And every once in a while, it alerts you to meetups and other events and news of interest. The newsletter is free and signing up is really easy. Simply text BF World to 33444. Okay. Are you ready to explore medicine, science, and disease in the early American Republic? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is a historian of ideas and environments in the Atlantic world. He's a former Chemical Heritage Haas Fellow, and he's the author of the book Feverish Bodies, Enlightened Minds, Science and the Yellow Fever Controversy in the Early American Republic. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Thomas Appel.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Thomas, you open Feverish Bodies, Enlightened Minds by stating that yellow fever constituted one of the most pressing natural problems in the early national period. And I really want us to explore this idea in our conversation. But before we dive into the details of the early Republic's yellow fever epidemics, I wonder if we could just start with, what is yellow fever? Would you tell us about yellow fever and what the disease is like?
Sure. Yellow fever is caused by a virus which is transmitted to humans through bites of female members of the Aedes aegypti mosquito. Both the virus and its vector, the mosquito, are originally from Africa, and today the disease prevails primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and in South America, particularly around the Amazon basin. So you'll often hear yellow fever mentioned in the same breath as malaria, and it's true that these are both tropical diseases that are spread through mosquito bites. But in terms of the violence with which it afflicts human beings, yellow fever has a little bit more in common with Ebola than malaria. In fact, both yellow fever and Ebola are classified as hemorrhagic fevers, which means that they produce massive internal bleeding in victims. So yellow fever will strike in two phases. The first is called the acute phase. And in this phase, victims will exhibit generalized symptoms like fever, headache, chills, nausea, vomiting. And then the symptoms will disappear. And most people, or a good portion of the people, will never have the reoccurrence of symptoms. They just get better. For the unfortunate ones, they progress into a second phase called the toxic phase. And this is marked by an intensification of symptoms along with jaundice, the yellowing of the skin that actually gives the disease its name. This is indicative of damage done to the liver. Patients will show signs of delirium and confusion, again, a symptom of liver damage. And victims will bleed from the nose, mouth, and eyes at certain times. And in the kind of final agonies, they will throw up a black vomit, which is a mixture of partially digested blood. As for mortality rates, public health studies today show that about 5 to 7% of people who get yellow fever die from the disease. But this is with modern medical attention. During the period that I study in the early republic, from 1793 to 1805, this kind of continuous wave of epidemics, the mortality rates were a lot higher. So to give you one example, when yellow fever struck Philadelphia in 1793, the city had about 50,000 people living in it, and about 5,000 people died. So even if everybody in the city got the disease, that'd still be around a 10% mortality rate. We know, however, that upwards of 20,000 people left the city during the epidemic. So mortality was something more like a quarter, a third, maybe even up to a half of the people who were afflicted. So yellow fever is an incredibly deadly disease. Getting it didn't mean certain death, but it was certainly not odds that anyone wanted to take.
This disease sounds awful. And what's more surprising about it is that it sounds like yellow fever shouldn't have been a problem in North America at all. I mean, you noted that yellow fever is prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa and the Amazon basin in South America. So we have to wonder, how did early Americans come into contact with yellow fever, and how did the disease spread once it arrived in an early American city? Because we are talking about epidemics, which means that there were widespread occurrences of the disease once it came to North America. So did Americans spread the disease to one another after someone was bitten by that yellow fever carrying mosquito?
No, they had to get it from a mosquito bite. So this is not a disease that was very common in the United States, in North America. Before the 1790s, there were only a handful of relatively minor epidemics. So there was an outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia in the 1760s, an outbreak in New York in the 1740s, but it was a very rare disease. And there's a good reason for this. The mosquito that transmits, the Aedes aegypti, can't survive winter temperatures. So anytime that yellow fever occurred in the United States, it had to be re-imported. So it had to be imported from some place where the Aedes aegypti can live year-round. And the place from which Americans were importing it was the Caribbean islands, where A. aegypti was native and where yellow fever was relatively common. So American port cities like Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Boston, all had extensive commercial interactions with the Caribbean islands, particularly the French colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, which at the time was the leading producer of sugar and coffee. So, merchants were visiting the port cities. Just to give you some indication of the scale of trade between Saint-Domingue and American port cities, in the 1790s, it was not uncommon for more than 200 vessels from Saint-Domingue to arrive in Philadelphia. There's still a question of, Americans were reporting yellow fever from the Caribbean, probably specifically from Saint-Domingue. But why in the 1790s? Why wasn't this a problem before? And why did it cease to be a problem after 1805, at least for the Eastern Seaboard? And the reason was the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution started as a slave revolt and quickly morphed into this sort of all-encompassing geopolitical conflict. And both the French and the British were interested in quelling the rebellion there and resuming the production of sugar. Right? Sugar is a major cash crop at the time, probably the leading cash crop at the time. So the French and British, in their eagerness to stop this slave rebellion, send massive armies to Saint-Domingue in order to put down this rebellion. And, with the influx of these tens of thousands of non-immune soldiers, it created the perfect breeding ground for yellow fever, because the mosquitoes that were infected with the virus could feed on these soldiers, stir up a yellow fever epidemic, and then the traders who were moving back and forth between places like Philadelphia and Saint-Domingue could relatively easily transfer the virus and the mosquito to Philadelphia, New York, and the other cities that were afflicted. So this is why epidemic yellow fever was a problem from 1793 to 1805. That date span relatively approximates the length of the Haitian Revolution, which goes from about 1790 to 1804. And that's not a coincidence. Those are intimately related to each other.
So yellow fever was really just a consequence of trade with the Caribbean. Now, speaking as we are about the connections and consequences between yellow fever and trade, Kyle would like to know just how much yellow fever epidemics impacted the commerce of the United States' major port cities.
Yeah, there's certainly a number of ways of taking measure of yellow fever's impacts. On the one hand, you can try to kind of tally up the physical damage, the deaths, the disruptions to the economy, and to just normal patterns of life. So in the 1790s, Philadelphia was the nation's capital. And every time yellow fever occurred, or even if people thought yellow fever was going to occur, the government essentially shut down and the president had to flee. And Philadelphia, New York were also the leading commercial centers at the time. And so while yellow fever was raging, there was very little commerce being done, very little productivity. But rather than deterring commerce, yellow fever wasn't going to deter enterprising merchants who had a lot of money on the line and a lot of profits to be made. So rather than really deterring commerce, what it did was motivate public health movements. So all of the affected cities revamped their public health institutions, instituted new quarantine rules and regulations that were designed to arrest ships that might be bringing yellow fever into the port cities. And they invested heavily in cleanliness measures, employed sweepers and cleaners to pick up garbage and filth from the cities. So, it's certainly yellow fever caused a lot of anxieties about commerce and stopped commerce at times, but it didn't deter commerce completely. Really, it motivated the energies to rid the cities of these diseases.
Now, what exactly happened when a city in the United States experienced an outbreak of yellow fever? Emily would like to know more about period treatments for yellow fever and how early Americans tried to cure each other of the disease.
Well, there were many approaches to treatment. Doctors, depending on where they were taught and sort of what medical community they had joined with, had specific remedies to offer. But they were all based on views of the human body as a systematic whole, as a system of balances where fluids and stimuli had to be in balance in order for people to be in good health. And ill health, unhealth, was treated as some kind of disruption to balance in the body system. So treatments were geared towards restoring balances. And this meant usually getting rid of certain kinds of fluids that were causing an imbalance. So this is why bleeding, for example, was still a very common remedy in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So there's a very good example of this, a notorious treatment that was advocated by a Philadelphia physician named Benjamin Rush, who advocated for massive bloodletting, taking several pints of blood at a time and applying medicines that caused patients to empty their bowels and to throw up. He wanted to sort of rid the body of excess fluids and substances in this kind of very distinct and drastic way. So Rush was not necessarily the typical physician. In fact, he was criticized for this type of treatment, but virtually everyone else employed some kind of similar type of treatment. They might just have advocated for a little less bloodletting or the application of purgatives that were a little less violent than Rush's. But again, all of these treatments are based on a view of the body as a systematic whole, as a kind of system of balances that needed to be maintained.
Rush's purgative treatments sound almost as awful as the disease to me. But, I also understand that I'm thinking about this, yellow fever and its treatment with my 21st century understanding of medicine. So, out of curiosity, how would doctors treat yellow fever today?
So today, there are no specific cures for yellow fever. In fact, there aren't even effective antivirals that can be used. So the best thing for a patient is to get into a hospital and to have plenty of IV fluids, painkillers to help tolerate the pain. And if you can arrest the disease early enough in the first phase, then you can prevent it from getting into the second phase, which is when people really start to die in large numbers. So it's really just close medical attention, no specific cure. And I suspect that, if talking about the heightened mortality rates in the 1790s, I suspect that, people like Rush were actually harming their patients a lot more than they were helping them.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. In Feverish Bodies, Enlightened Minds, Thomas reveals that there were two schools of thought in the early Republic about yellow fever, how it spread, and how doctors should treat it. Thomas, would you tell us about these two schools of thought?
Sure. The debate about the cause of yellow fever split into these two camps. One of them I call the localist camp. And localists believed that yellow fever was caused by local conditions within cities. And they pointed to these kinds of clouds of gas called miasmas. And they thought that in particular garbage and decaying matter, filth and sewage that accumulates in a city emitted a kind of noxious gas or pestilential effluvium is used all kinds of colorful terms to describe them. But it's some kind of gas or air into the city causing people to be sick. So that's the localist view. The contagionists thought that yellow fever could be transmitted from person to person, that a victim carried in some way a seed of the disease, and that seed could transfer directly to another person. And accordingly, they believed that yellow fever had been imported from abroad. So it wasn't being created from domestic sources like the localists believe it was being imported from somewhere else. So both sides of the argument, it's important to know, had really good points of view. They had good evidence to back their beliefs, and they had good rationales for defending them. And that's why the yellow fever debate lasted as long as it was and was as divisive as it was. If it had been easy to determine the cause, if it was clear, then there would be no need for debate. So I'll give you a couple examples. Again, the localists were right to point to domestic sources for yellow fever because of the habits of the mosquito that transmits the disease. So Aedes aegypti prefers to lay its eggs in artificial containers of water, like troughs and rain barrels, the things that humans have around them. So the mosquito will only tend to prevail within cities and not very far beyond. And that meant that yellow fever would only prevail in cities. If it were a contagious disease, localists said, then why weren't people outside of the cities getting the disease? It seemed to be tied to the city, so therefore it must be something in the city that's causing it. The contagionists also had very good points of view. We know that Aedes aegypti can't live in Philadelphia and New York. And indeed, it had to be reintroduced every year. And contagionists could usually even find vessels that had arrived in the ports with victims on board who had yellow fever. And they could tie them pretty close to the outbreak of yellow fever in the cities. And they said, look, there seems to be an obvious relationship here. In comes this vessel. They have 4 patients with yellow fever. A week or so later, people in the city start getting sick. There's clearly a connection here. So both sides had these really good points of view. And the fact that they had good points of view that pushed the debate forward and led the investigators of yellow fever to examine fields of study that are not traditionally associated with medical inquiry and led them to articulate assumptions that usually are left unsaid.
Did physicians who subscribe to these different schools of thought develop and prescribe different treatments for the disease? I mean, did physicians treat yellow fever based on their localist or contagionist ideas?
Yeah, it's a complex question. So first of all, I should point out that both the localist theory and the contagionist theory were viewed as being totally legitimate medical theories. In other words, no one thought that all diseases were caused by local circumstances, nor did anyone think that all diseases were caused by contagion, right? There were certain types of diseases like smallpox that were obviously caused by contagion. And not even the most ardent localist when it came to yellow fever would have denied that smallpox was caused by a contagion. So it wasn't like these doctors were partisans of one theory before they encountered yellow fever. How they came to their respective camps, I think it does have something to do with medical training. The people who embraced localist ideas tended overwhelmingly to have been educated at Scottish universities or at the University of Pennsylvania, which was essentially modeled after Scottish universities, particularly the University of Edinburgh. And they were trained in common sense philosophy. For example, the contagionists tended not to have been educated through these Scottish channels, and actually a disproportionate number of them were surgeons. And I suspect that there's something about the kind of physicality of contagion, that it's sort of this, at least you can imagine it as being a kind of palpable thing in the way that surgery deals with kind of physical, palpable realities.
Most movements have leaders. Did the localists and contagionists have leaders? And if they did, who were these leaders and what were their leading arguments?
They did have leaders. So in the localist camp, there were prominent physicians and natural philosophers like Benjamin Rush, who was probably the best known for advocating for localism, I guess you could say. But there were others like Samuel Latham Mitchell, who was a professor at Columbia College, and even Noah Webster, the New Englander, better known for his creation of the American Dictionary in the 19th century. He was a major factor in the yellow fever debates, advocating for localism. The contagionists have, in retrospect, probably lesser known figures, but their leader was the Philadelphia physician William Curry, who was a member of the College of Physicians there and a prominent figure in the culture of Philadelphia, as well as folks like Isaac Catherall, who was another Philadelphia doctor and surgeon.
And just so we're clear, did localists and contagionists call themselves localists and contagionists? Or are these terms that you created here in the 21st century to describe these two schools of early Republican medical thought?
These are my terms. You'll find these terms used in historical literature from the present to refer to these respective schools of thought. They didn't label themselves that way. They would say something like, I advocate for the local or domestic origin of yellow fever, or they would simply say that, I think yellow fever is contagious and imported. So they weren't using those precise terms, no.
As we've been discussing, yellow fever, its causes, and the reasons it spread really seemed to baffle early American physicians. So many early American physicians turned to history to see if they could find answers to their questions about yellow fever. Thomas, would you tell us about these doctors' historical research and about the ways their historical research influenced their ideas about medicine?
I think in some ways this was something of an automatic response for early Republican intellectuals who were historically conscious. History in the late 18th century was a much more, not just popular, but a sort of much more meaningful field of inquiry for intellectuals. So early Republicans thought historically, they constantly compared their situation to the past. They styled art and architecture after classical motifs. They believed that history taught lessons, that you could look at lives of eminent people and learn about virtue through those examples. History for them showed consequences of policy and behavior. And history operated through cycles. What happened in the past wasn't sort of distant and forgotten, but it might well have something to say about the present. Right? So I think that in some ways, the appeal to the past in pursuit of yellow fever was extended from this kind of deep appreciation and love for history. But it was also used to help determine the cause of yellow fever. We've started to find this immediately in the medical literature about yellow fever. It starts with sort of casual references to the past, that yellow fever is sort of like the plague at Constantinople or at Rome. And then it progressed into elaborate studies that painstakingly compared the circumstances under which yellow fever occurred to the circumstances under which past diseases occurred. So there's a good example written by someone who had advocated for localism, a young man named Elihu Hubbard Smith. He wrote this essay called The Plague of Athens. It appeared as the first article in a medical journal called the Medical Repository. The Medical Repository was actually the first journal in the United States specifically devoted to science and medicine. So this is the first article in this journal. And in it, Smith examines the circumstances under which plague occurred at Athens. And by the way, the plague at Athens is the plague that occurred during the Peloponnesian War, famously described by Thucydides. So he examines the circumstances of the plague there and decides that it must have been a local disease. It arose from domestic sources in Athens. And then he compares Athens to Philadelphia and New York and decides that they share so much in common with each other that it must be that New York and Philadelphia had domestic diseases too, right? So this is kind of what historical analyses of disease were like. They were comparative in their nature. They didn't decisively determine the cause of yellow fever, but they showed that the domestic origin of yellow fever sort of fit into the patterns of the past, that it could be made sense in terms of the cycles of history. Another example comes from Noah Webster, who wrote a massive book about disease history called The Brief History of Epidemic and Pestilential Diseases. It's published in 1798. And it's this 2-volume book, about 1,000 pages long, that is essentially a compendium of all the diseases that had ever occurred, according to Webster, according to his sources. And it describes all of the epidemics that had ever occurred, and it describes the other kinds of strange phenomena that accompanied them. So volcanoes and earthquakes. And what Webster ends up concluding is that if you look at the past and you see its patterns, you see the patterns of disease, you'll notice that there are these sorts of periods where all kinds of calamitous things happen, not just pestilences, but volcanoes, earthquakes, and other kinds of strange phenomena as well. And of course, he finds that the United States in the 1790s is involved in one of these kinds of strange periods of history when all kinds of strange things are happening, right? So again, this is how folks in the 1790s, early 19th century were thinking about history and disease, that history disclosed the patterns through which disease occurred. And you could kind of, even if it didn't prove that yellow fever was caused by local origins or contagion, you could at least plausibly place it into the cycles of the past.
This is really interesting. And as you're describing these physicians' turn to history to figure out yellow fever, I'm realizing that when we look back on the history of the early United States, it really seems like we could actually look at some of these doctors as some of the nation's earliest historians.
Yeah, I suppose so. And, you know, not only are they among the first kinds of historians, but they're actually exploring similar themes as other historians. So an early Republic historian that often comes to mind is a South Carolinian named David Ramsay, who wrote about the American Revolution. And Ramsay, when he wrote about the Revolution, was sort of grappling with the themes of newness and repetition. You know, was the United States something new? Was it a novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages? Or was it still going to be sort of trapped in the cycles that always happened, right? And the same kind of themes are coming out in yellow fever histories and disease histories. You know, are we trapped in the same cycles of disease, or can we escape? So yeah, these are definitely efforts meant to determine the cause of the disease or help determine the cause of the disease. But they're also efforts to answer these big questions that are on everyone's mind. You know, where are we going? Is this society something new, or is it something old? And are we just kind of fooled into thinking it's something new?
Now, in addition to history, early American physicians also turned to chemistry as a way to get at the bottom of yellow fever and its causes. And after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, perhaps Thomas will tell us what the field of chemistry was like during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. History and archival work go hand in hand. Letters, journals, and diaries are just some of the key records historians use to better understand the past. In fact, researchers will spend hours examining and transcribing all these different types of records, all to help them see particular moments of the past better. They may also spend lots of time and money traveling to archives to conduct their research too. Although now, research is getting a bit easier and a bit cheaper to do as more and more archives are digitizing their records and putting them up online so that anyone with a computer can examine them. In fact, The Omohundro Institute, the producer of Ben Franklin's World, is a primary partner in one such project to put the entire archive of the Georgian monarchs online. Locked for over a century in the Round Tower at Windsor Castle, the papers of the King Georges, George the First, Second, Third, and Fourth, as well as of King William IV and all their family members and advisors, are now in the process of being digitized. And historians have only seen a small fraction of what is in these some 350,000 items in this collection. Now, the Georgian Papers program is actually a great opportunity for all fans of history, because soon you can explore these records for yourself, and you can help historians and archivists transcribe these handwritten documents as they continue to come up online. So if you enjoy exploring handwritten historical documents, you should sign up to be among the first in the Omohundro Institute's team of citizen transcribers. To become a citizen transcriber, just visit benfranklinsworld.com/transcribe. Okay, Thomas, would you tell us what the field of chemistry looked like during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and about why early American doctors thought that chemistry might hold some of the answers that they were looking for?
Chemistry and medicine shared a pretty intimate bond in the 18th century. As it was taught as part of university education, chemistry only survived because it was part of medical education, right? It was something that medical students had to study, so they had to attend lectures in chemistry. And this was so that they would understand the basic preparations of medicines, but also so that they would know that sort of what bodies are made out of, to understand the kind of materials of the body. Now, in the 1790s, chemistry was also a field of study that was undergoing a transformation, a revolution even, that historians sometimes call the chemical revolution. And the chief figure in the chemical revolution is a French chemist named Antoine Laurent Lavoisier. Lavoisier was an extremely wealthy Parisian chemist who actually was executed on the guillotine in 1794, but not before publishing his researches that led to this kind of total reimagination of chemistry. So the chemical revolution has three main contributions. One of them is that Lavoisier identified a new substance that he called oxygen and showed that it was the critical agent in a number of chemical processes, including combustion, things burning, respiration, and calcination. Calcination is what happens to metals when they're heated up. The second contribution is that Lavoisier and his colleagues offered a comprehensive nomenclature, a new naming system for chemicals and the compounds that they form. So words like oxygen and hydrogen and words for compounds like nitric oxide and etc. Those all come from this French nomenclature published in 1789 for the first time. But the third main contribution to chemistry, and the one that had the most impact on yellow fever, was that Lavoisier's ideas fostered a new way of imagining matter. So even in the late 18th century, most learned people thought that substances like air and water were not compounds of materials, of elements, but that they were actually elements themselves, that they couldn't be broken down any further than they were. And Lavoisier showed that no, they're not elements, they're actually just states of matter, and that any chemical could theoretically enter into these states of matter. So for people who were following this chemical revolution, it struck them with the realization that there was a lot more complexity to the materials around them, particularly to air. And so American chemists were very enthusiastic about the chemical revolution in the early 1790s. People like Samuel Latham Mitchell, a localist, and the professor of chemistry at Columbia was a big advocate of Lavoisier's chemistry. He taught about it, he wrote about it, and he used it to try to identify the makeup of the air that caused yellow fever. The localists had always said that some kind of emanation from putrid materials causes yellow fever. So with Lavoisier's chemistry as a guide, maybe they could study that air and figure out what it's actually made of. So we get in the 1790s a kind of profusion of, frankly, fanciful and far-fetched notions about what the air that causes yellow fever is made out of. Mitchell proposes one. He says that there's a certain compound made out of nitrogen, calls it septon, that causes yellow fever. And what he was thinking was that if you look at decaying substances and filth and garbage, you'll often find that nitrogen and nitrogenous compounds are conspicuous in them. And so he's noticing this. He's saying, oh, look, there's these kind of nitrogen compound. This is septon, and it must be the thing that is causing yellow fever. It's causing the decay causes yellow fever. So it's ultimately septon that's responsible. So it's kind of a bit of a, far-fetched idea, especially from, modern perspective. And it was warmly received by his peers, but no one necessarily thought that he had gotten it right, that he had actually labeled the chemical that is responsible for yellow fever. But similarly to history, theories like this plausibly explained the production of a yellow fever gas from decaying materials. Even if Mitchell didn't get it right, even if the others didn't get it right, at least the localists could use chemistry to sort of plausibly describe how a gas like this might evolve. So just as history helped the localists more than it helped the contagionists, chemistry also did that.
History and chemistry weren't the only places that early American scientists and physicians looked to for answers about yellow fever. They also turned to God. Thomas, would you tell us about the role that religion played in the yellow fever debates?
Yes, religious arguments come from many people in society, and not just religious figures themselves, but also from scientists, from people who were recognized as authorities over natural knowledge. So it's important to keep in mind, I think we associate figures like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson with early American science, and they were deists who were sort of progressive thinkers who believed in a creator God, but weren't willing to go much further than that. There was a creator and there was the created world, but that was it. Most early Republican intellectuals were deeply religious people, pious Christians. And as such, they believed that yellow fever must have a purpose, that it must have some kind of divine purpose, because God wouldn't allow an evil like yellow fever to exist sort of accidentally. That God was benevolent and wise and powerful. There was a purpose for this disease. And there must be a just purpose, that if God afflicted people with this evil, he must be doing it for some reason, as a punishment for sin. And they further believed that whatever rules people were breaking, whatever sins they were committing, must be found in the scriptures, and that ways to correct those sins must be found in the scriptures as well. So that's the kind of religious side of these individuals. But these early American scientists are also scientifically minded individuals. They believe in the kind of empirical methodologies of science. They believe that the world was law-like in its composition, that natural laws determined phenomena. So they were unwilling to say that God was directly intervening in human affairs to afflict people. Right? So the localists, again, capitalize on theology to their benefit. And the argument that they articulate goes something like this. The inhabitants of cities had negligently and sinfully allowed dirt and filth and sewage to accumulate. And God had made the world so that the accumulation of these substances naturally produced yellow fever. So they united both a kind of religious argument about punishment and redemption with a scientific argument about natural process creating disease. And when they turned to public health remedies, when they advocated for public health remedies like cleaning the streets, they presented their argument not only as scientists who had a kind of rational solution to a problem, but as religious figures who had a kind of crusade in mind. So they were advocating for public health, not just with a kind of purely scientifically rational point of view, but with a tremendous amount of religious fervor. They weren't just going to correct a natural problem. They were going to fix a moral problem with people. People had laxed, that they had forgotten rules about uncleanliness, which are very clearly stated in the Bible. So the localists, again, sort of craft these theological arguments that helps make localism more plausible and possible. The contagionists, on the other hand, fail to do this. They don't even actually try to articulate religious arguments, which is, I think, telling about them. But in the absence of any argument from the contagionists, people were left to conclude that this contagious particle that was causing yellow fever was just sort of randomly bouncing around and indiscriminately killing people. And the localists point this out. They say, look, this doesn't make any sense. Why would this seed of yellow fever that causes the disease, why would it just be kind of bouncing around and killing people without any purpose? And they pointed out that the localists' argument was actually not only just more scientifically valid, they thought, but also more pious.
The yellow fever epidemics we've been talking about were very large public health concerns. So it seems like they must have captured the attention of the new Republican government. Was this the case, Thomas? And if so, in what ways did concerns about these epidemics intersect with the politics of the new nation?
There's certainly some overt ways in which yellow fever opinions could be political. So the followers of the localist theory tended to be supporters of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. And the believers in contagionists tended to be adherents to a kind of Hamiltonian federalism. This doesn't completely map perfectly, but it's generally true. And there's a way in which you could see self-interest in this for the localists, the kind of Jeffersonian localists, portraying cities as dens of vice, as Jefferson believed, jibed with the view of America as a sort of yeoman's republic, as a kind of small farmers' republic, and in which cities didn't have a place because cities were decadent and led to luxury and vice. At the same time, the contagionist view vindicated cities. And Hamilton was, a fan of cities and of manufacturing. And so if yellow fever or diseases were coming in from abroad, then this was good reason to sort of move away from connections with the outside world and to develop cities in the United States and to pursue manufacturing there rather than importing this. So there's a kind of way in which you can make sense of the opinions in these kind of overt political ways. But as I said, it doesn't perfectly map. There's lots of localists like Noah Webster, for example, who's an ardent Federalist and really despiser of Jefferson. So it doesn't hold completely true. There are subtler ways in which politics informed the yellow fever debate too. So both sides in the yellow fever debate depicted their opposition, the opposite camp, as a faction. And they claimed that the opposite side was not only sort of advocating for a contrary view, but they were actually conspiring to subvert the truth, which is exactly the sort of language that political parties, that nascent political parties in the early republic were using. And so there's this way in which this language actually proved to be mutually reinforcing, that participants in the yellow fever debate could look at the factionalism that they perceived in the medical debate and say, well, this seems plausible that this could happen because the same thing happens in politics, and vice versa. So I think that yellow fever actually contributed to the divisiveness of politics, and that political divisiveness contributed to the divisiveness of the yellow fever debate. They were sort of reinforcing each other in that way. And it's probably a pity that that happened, because this kind of divisiveness, this kind of political factionalism undermined chances for compromise. And perhaps the medical inquirers of the time would have been better off sort of picking the good elements from contagionism and the good elements from localism and combining them into some kind of synthesis.
Yellow fever isn't really something we hear a lot about today. So why do you think it's important that we take the time to better understand this disease and all the debates and controversies surrounding it during the early republic? I mean, how does a better understanding of these early yellow fever epidemics help us better understand the history of the early republic?
Well, it shows how deeply intertwined religious and scientific thought was. And as much as the investigators of yellow fever wanted to confine their analyses to the examination of the facts, they were clearly influenced by other motives too, like theological considerations. And I think that this shows that it's hard in the early republic to analyze any given domain of thought without giving consideration to the others. So, I don't know if there is such a thing as purely scientific thought in the early republic. Religion was a kind of necessary part of that. And I think that the same thing applies to other domains of thought, like politics, that it's hard to think about political thought standing alone. It's clearly influenced too by religious and scientific considerations. So I think that on the whole, when we're thinking about early Republican thought, we have to remember that domains of knowledge bled into each other. They were not distinct and separate. And this has a deeper consequence for understanding all early Republican thought. I think, too, that yellow fever itself shows just how thoroughly incorporated early American people were into the environment and ecology of the New World. As much as they wanted to consider themselves a place apart or something unique, they were very clearly deeply intertwined with the flows of goods, the flow of disease in the broader Atlantic world. And that their behaviors and actions in regards to consumption, for example, commerce, had consequences that they didn't anticipate, in a certain way paid the price for.
Okay, let's jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if yellow fever-carrying mosquitoes had never arrived in the United States? How would the history of early America and its pursuit of scientific and medical knowledge have been different?
Well, I think that there would have been less divisiveness in the scientific and medical communities. Yellow fever really splintered medical communities in cities. So in Philadelphia, for example, there had been a kind of monolithic medical institution called the College of Physicians. But yellow fever caused a kind of defection of many in the College of Physicians, and they went and created a new medical institution. And that divide continued on. There was a division within the medical and scientific communities. I think that if yellow fever had never been to the United States, Philadelphia might have retained some of its luster as the commercial center of the United States. As it was, the kind of waning, perhaps, of Philadelphia had already begun, and New York became the city that took over. New York was also a city that had yellow fever, so this argument doesn't necessarily go that far. But I think that Philadelphia was labeled after this as a yellow fever city, and I think its reputation afterwards may have suffered. But at the same time, these kinds of questions cause you to think, backwards rather than forwards. If there hadn't been yellow fever in the United States, then that would probably mean that there hadn't been a Haitian Revolution. And if there hadn't been a Haitian Revolution, then who knows what precondition would have also been missing. So it seems like, yellow fever was a consequence of American involvement with the Caribbean, with Americans' taste for the goods that the slaves in the Caribbean produced. And so it was probably unavoidable in that way.
So Thomas, what aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
Right now, I'm doing some research on electromagnetism in the early 19th century and the way that scientific communities, research communities were created around electromagnetic researches and what their researches into electromagnetism meant for the Republic. And not just in terms of its concrete contributions in the new forms of energy, for example, but in how it changed religious thinking, how it influenced perceptions of the social elite, and a number of other factors.
And if we have questions about yellow fever in the early Republic, how can we contact you?
You can reach me at thomas.appel@menlo.edu. That's menlo.edu if you have any questions. You can also find my book at the Stanford University Press website. That's sup.org. Or it's available on amazon.com.
Thomas Appel, thank you for taking us through the yellow fever epidemics of the early Republic and what they reveal about the development of science and medicine in the new nation.
Thank you very much.
Yellow fever is a gruesome, hemorrhagic fever that struck early American cities repeatedly between the 1790s and early 1800s. Now, today, we know that yellow fever is a virus that's spread by the female Aedes aegypti mosquito, which is indigenous to sub-Saharan Africa, South America, and the Caribbean, not North America. But these facts went unknown in early America. In fact, throughout our conversation with Thomas, we could see just how much early American physicians struggled to find answers to what caused yellow fever and how the disease spread. Now, as early American physicians grappled with yellow fever, they split into two schools of thought regarding the cause, spread, and treatment of the disease: the localist school and the contagionist school. Localists believed that yellow fever was caused by local conditions. Specifically, they believed it was caused and spread by poor sanitation in early American cities. Contagionists, on the other hand, believed that yellow fever was a contagious disease that came from outside the United States, and that humans spread to one another during outbreaks. As Thomas revealed, each school of thought had good arguments for what they believed, but neither one developed a full understanding of the virus and how it spread. Exploring yellow fever and how early American physicians thought about it allows us to better understand early American ideas about disease and medicine. As Thomas noted, we can really see how religious faith, historical thinking, politics, and scientific ideas were all intertwined in early Republican minds and explanations. Plus, studying yellow fever allows us to see just how thoroughly interconnected the Atlantic world was during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and just how connected and incorporated early Americans were in that world. Because yellow fever had to be imported into North America, so each new virus indicates that early American ships brought new batches of virus-carrying mosquitoes to North American shores, which means Americans were interacting and trading with ports in the Caribbean, South America, and Africa. Look for more information about Thomas, his book, Feverish Bodies, Enlightened Minds, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/174. The Georgian Papers program is digitizing the papers of the King Georges. So if you enjoy exploring history and reading the documents we have from the past, you should join the Omohundro Institute's team of citizen transcribers and help them transcribe this fantastic collection. To join the team, visit benfranklinsworld.com/transcribe. I received production assistance with this episode from Holly White. Thank you, Holly. Finally, what do you think of early American physicians' use of history to better understand yellow fever? Do you think using history can help us better understand diseases in our own present day? I'm curious, so please send me your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.